Okay, so welcome back to another episode of Global Card Collectors. Today we have a real special treat for me and anyone who's heard him before. We have Iowa Dave Sports Cards. His IG handle is Iowa_Dave_sports cards. And he has an excellent podcast that started what I can see is in November of last year, called The Shallow End, a sports card podcast experience on a budget. And I really embraced Dave's podcast from the get-go. I highly encourage you to go back and listen to his earlier episodes. I went back and listened to episode 5 called "There's Nothing Wrong with Your PC" in the last couple days, and it's one of your best. I mean, I recommend them all, to be honest, but that one really nailed it, I think, in many ways. A lot of good I think psychological elements to collecting, and especially about how many of us got back into the hobby at the at the peak, and when things were overpriced and crazy and all these things. So I think it's very relatable to those who, particularly on that chronology, let's say. But without further introduction, we'll get into the conversation. Thanks for joining us, Dave. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I love what you and your team are doing with this show, and it means a lot to be on. This is one of my favorites. I look forward to speaking with you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, you also were very kind. You were the first person to kind of mention our podcast when we launched, I think, in January, in a story, just kind of, using Instagram, as you call, for community rather than status, and kind of just alerting others to our podcast, and hey, check it out. It's someone trying new content out there. So that was very appreciated. And then, of course, a couple weeks ago, I believe, on Stacking Slabs with Brett, you appeared. That's another podcast that I almost rarely miss, although he has so many these days that it's hard to hit them all, maybe. But you also referenced the show, so we're very appreciative. Will and I will cart Adami on Instagram for those first-time listeners. But yeah, so thanks for the encouragement. So yeah, I mean, how has the podcasting journey gone so far? You're about 6 months in. How do you feel about it at this point?
A little bit longer, actually. I started June of last year is when I began, but I know why you say November. My podcast originally, for about the first 5 months, was carried on somebody else's network. It was a network that's not there anymore, called the Wolfpack Network. And then the person who ran that got himself into some problems. And so in November, I started my own channel, but kept the Shallow End going. And I uploaded all my old episodes up to that point, but that was in November. And so that's why it looks like everything was in November. But I actually started June of last year, so I'm coming up on 11 months now since I've started. And the journey has been weird. It's been fun. It's been more than I imagined. It's been uncomfortable, like a lot of us who do this. I don't like the sound of my own voice. The worst part of it always is after I finish the recording, when I listen back to it to make sure it's technically okay, so I don't put anything out there that shouldn't be listened to. And it doesn't matter how long I do this, I keep thinking, is this really how I sound? But there's a great, really great collector, New York City sports cards. His name is Craig, and he has a podcast called Crosstown Cardboard. And I think I put out there once how much I don't like my voice, and he just said, nobody does, just deal with it. No one likes their voice. But I've been able to meet some really great people, and it's just been what a ride, and I'm ready to keep going.
Awesome. Glad to hear that. Yeah, I was gonna nominate you, for new podcast of the year or something, if we had those awards. I hope you keep going, because we have had a lot of attrition from various podcast content creators. So which has been a bit hard, I think, from my perspective. I'll just share too that I think, like you, I'm very much a huge podcast consumer. I think it's partly my search for community because I'm in Istanbul and there are collectors, but we don't have events to link up. And so I think podcasts really fill that need for me. Is it similar for you?
It is. At first, I used podcasts as a way to educate myself when I got back into the hobby to figure out what was going on now. Because I collected as a kid into my teens from about 1983 or 84 to 1990. 1990 is when I turned 16, which in the States is when you can drive. And it's not surprising that at that point I found other things to keep me busy. But so much changed. So much changed before I got back in, just like anybody else. And I really jumped back in, during COVID, and uh, all of a sudden cards had numbers and they were shiny, and there were so many more different sets. And Donruss wasn't Donruss. Donruss was owned by Panini, but Panini also bought these other IPs. But Upper Deck was there, but they couldn't do baseball. And I was like, what is even happening? And so, in fact, the first 6 months to a year that I got back into collecting, I was buying a lot of Donruss unlicensed baseball cards, not realizing they were even unlicensed until I realized one day, wait, there's no logo on that helmet. What's going on? And so podcasts helped me figure out what was going on. Then that was the cards were no longer enough after a while. It was a good start. Like you, I wanted to meet people. I wanted to become a part of the community, not in any false or artificial way, but just in some way to feel like it was more than being gratified just by whenever a card came in the mail. And by talking to people, or at least just talking about myself out there, it's helped me really connect to some people. And I value that as much as, if not more than, the cards themselves now.
So I mean, did you go to the National last year?
I did. It was my first national, so I went there. Uh, it was sort of a hurried event. I was there in town for 36 hours. Chicago is only a 3.5 hour drive from where I live. So I was able to zoom in, stay for a couple nights, and zoom out. And I'm excited. I'm going again this year.
Okay. So I'll be interested to hear, maybe I'm sure you'll kind of reflect maybe on the first national and this upcoming one, kind of the differences. And I would imagine you have a larger community now after the pod and such.
For sure. I'm looking forward to seeing some people there and looking forward to going in with less pressure and less confusion than I did last year.
Yeah, in a recent episode, you talked about how the anticipation of the national and kind of almost buying a card if you see it on eBay. The national is not so much about the cards or the card buying, but just the fun of being there and meeting people and just experiencing the whole thing, I guess.
If you took every card on eBay and shuffled them up and threw them all up in the air and they all landed in some random places, that's sort of what it's like trying to find a card at the National. If you're going there looking to find something specific, unless it's a common card, good luck. It's probably there somewhere, but you won't be able to find it most likely unless you're going table to table for 4 or 5 days. And so really the fun part of National is just seeing the cards and appreciating the cards that aren't yours and that you don't want, and then running into people and saying hi to the people who you've talked to over Instagram or some other social media.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. So let's kind of get into your collecting focus. I know you're a St. Louis Cardinals collector. For those listeners, that's if you don't know, it's a very successful baseball team. I actually did some research before this and realized, of course, everyone's probably heard of the Yankees. I mean, everywhere in the world you see Yankees hats for sale, knockoff or usually knockoffs. But in terms of total championships, the Cardinals are second all time. And so I if we want to use a soccer analogy, it's probably a terrible one, but I would say they're kind of like the Barcelona of baseball. And have just a very rich history. I followed baseball a lot growing up, kind of lost touch as the Giants, my team, faded in the 90s and 2000s, but then they had this kind of ridiculously lucky period where we won 3 titles. And you guys, we had to go through twice to get to those. And I remember my friends who also rooted for other National League teams being like, just beat the Cardinals. Like, so it's like, yeah, I guess we did, but I didn't have that feeling because we hadn't, it wasn't relevant before or something. So, anyway, a very storied franchise. Just wanted to introduce that. You grew up from your family, or how did you become a Cardinals fan?
I'm born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. My parents were into the Cardinals. My grandparents were into the Cardinals. My great grandfather was into the Cardinals. It's a bit of a religion there. Yes, and the reason that people say, "Hey, just beat the Cardinals," is because our fan base has become a bit obnoxious and drinking its own Kool-Aid over the last 20 years or so. Journalists pointed out that St. Louis fans would support their team win or lose. They had some of the best attendance even during down seasons. And so they would say, these are the best fans in baseball because the team always feels supported. And the players would say, we wish we could have done better, but man, we love the fans. But then the fans started calling themselves the best fans in baseball. And I think that's when we became obnoxious. And I have not said that except as a joke. It makes my stomach churn a little bit. I don't like hearing that. I don't think you should ever, you know, brag in that way. So it does make me uncomfortable. Maybe it's true. I don't know. Maybe we are the best fans in baseball, but you can't say that. But yeah, but you're right. The Cardinals have won the second most World Series after the New York Yankees. The franchise goes back to the late 19th century, to the late 1800s. It's been around a long time, and so it's St. Louis is a very divided city socially, even going back to the American Civil War. The one thing that people could talk about across the spectrum without getting into some argument about will be the Cardinals.
Okay.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
Or the Yankees maybe in the American League.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So your Yankees National League. Yeah, I mean, and St. Louis goes back, I mean, just historically, I mean, it was really the launching point for kind of discovering, after the Louisiana Purchase was made, it was from there that everyone was launching out, like Lewis and Clark and all these
Right.
to settle the West. So,
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's located right between the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, which are the two biggest rivers in the United States, which also makes it a very humid city, having those two rivers on each side of it, plus just being located in the central part of the U.S. Yeah, it's historic. It's historic. Lots. Probably over the last 75 years, it's deteriorated somewhat because it was contingent upon things like train travel and river travel. And of course, trucks and airplanes have become the means of cargo. It's dipped a little bit in terms of prestige. It used to be big enough to support two professional baseball teams. It also had the St. Louis Browns, which became the Baltimore Orioles in the 1950s.
didn't know that.
Yeah, they did. And so that's to give you an idea of how major of a metro area it was. It had two professional baseball teams, and now it's down to one baseball team, a hockey team, thankfully now an MLS team, which is very popular, a Major League Soccer team. Um, but the biggest sport in the US is football, and St. Louis has lost two football teams because they can't really support it, or they are unwilling to uh, vote for the taxes to buy a new stadium every 20 years, which I think is kind of great. Why should we pay for the stadium?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, you just read the recent NBA media deal that came out. I mean, I don't, it's just right. Insane stuff. So I agree with you on that one. Um, so long time history from your family, and you must have gone to games growing up. And who was your favorite player growing up?
My favorite player is not someone most people know because he's not in the Hall of Fame. If there was a Hall of Very Good, he would be a first ballot inductee. His name was Willie McGee. He played in the 1980s when I was a kid, which is the same time a genuine Hall of Famer named Ozzie Smith, who was the he has the highest defensive WAR in Major League history, defensive WAR being the metric to measure how many wins you contributed to playing defense, and he was the best ever. So Ozzie was face, but Willie was the one that local fans loved, and he was great. He won an MVP, he won a World Series, and played in 3 World Series, and had 2,000 hits. He looked really funny. He was really gangly. His nickname was E.T., like the movie, because he debuted the same year as E.T., so everyone called him that because he was just kind of goofy looking. And he's still around. He's still around as a roving coach sometimes, and people love him. He's just part of this city. So he was my favorite. My favorite non-St. Louis Cardinal was Ricky Henderson, the Hall of Famer. My opinion, the not even my opinion, he's quantitatively the greatest leadoff hitter in all of Major League history. But the other athletes I like growing up were Magic Johnson. We didn't have a basketball team, but I had a lot of family, have a lot of family still in Los Angeles. And so I go out and visit and was able to see him play in
Oh,
person a couple of
wow.
times, and just terrific. Saw him pull off a triple double against the Seattle Supersonics,
Hmm.
which was terrific. So really love seeing him play. And I tried to adopt the Atlanta Hawks as well because they were another St. Louis franchise that left. They were the St. Louis Hawks in the early 1970s. So loved Dominique Wilkins with the Hawks and loved Magic Johnson. So really, baseball and basketball were always the two sports that I enjoyed the most.
Okay. So did Maravich play for the Hawks in St. Louis? No.
No, it was probably about 3 or 4 years after they left St. Louis and moved to Atlanta.
Okay.
That's the point that he moved to the Hawks.
Okay. Okay. Um, Very good. So those are, I mean, I do remember McGee. And I think I mean, I guess I was following baseball a lot in the 80s, but I probably had some cards. I mean, junk wax era and stuff. I was just totally into it as a kid. So I remember liking him too. And Ozzie Guillen. Like he was, yeah, both of them.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Willie is
Ozzie
just one of the people who Ozzie
Ozzie
Smith, right?
Smith, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. Ozzie, he
Yeah.
played at the same time as Ozzie, and they were both shortstops, so it's totally
Okay.
fine.
All right.
Yeah, Willie McGee is just he has his number retired, by the Cardinals as he should, and he's just a local folk hero, and that's great because when I got back into the hobby, I never had a Willie McGee rookie card. And I thought, how much is this going to cost me? And it was like $12. So I was like, great, because nobody wants Willie McGee, and I could do that and not blink. Just grab the card. It was terrific.
Yeah, that's definitely been a joy, I know, for people coming back in, kind of those cards we couldn't get as a kid, or couldn't afford, obviously. Um, do you have any of cards of these players with you? You want to show off now or
I don't have cards of them with me, but I do have
okay?
cards that are somewhat related to St. Louis basketball, for example. And I
Cool.
don't know how good the lighting is in here, so after the Hawks left St. Louis, that right around then is when the ABA, which eventually merged with the NBA, but the ABA was up and going, and St. Louis had a team called the Spirits of St. Louis. It wasn't the St. Louis Spirits; it was the Spirits of St. Louis, which was named after the airplane that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in the 1920s, called the Spirit of St. Louis, when he flew across the Atlantic and landed I think it was in France is where he landed ultimately. And so they had a player named Marvin Barnes, Marvin Bad News Barnes. He had that nickname for a reason. He was into lots of bad stuff. He's no longer with us. So I have his 1975 Topps card here to PSA 8 on the St. Louis Spirits. And there's that. I can see that there.
Cup of water. That's
Cool.
such a 70s card. Wow.
That's a 70s card. There might be water in there. We don't know with him what could have been in there, but it
Right.
was well time. He would show up and he loved his money, um, and fur coats and fancy cars and who knows what he was in who knows what was in his body at that time either. This is a beautiful Topps card, and for it to be preserved in an 8, it's just a nice looking card there.
I agree. It's very well centered, looks clean, looks great.
Looks clean. Moses Malone played the Hall of Famer, played for the Spirits as well, but there are no playing day cards of him. I would love to have had one. There are some custom cards. I don't really want any of those though.
Mhm.
But I would love to have a Moses card if it had existed. But Marvin will have to do. There's a wonderful book. It's an oral history of the ABA, and it's called Loose Balls. by Terry Pluto. And just the story is about how they would try to get Marvin to the game on time, and how they would try to get, he might show up for practice, he might not. If he showed up to the game, it might be a couple minutes late. He'd be there eventually, and then he would score 35 points. And so he was a really good player. He was a really good player. Yeah. Good. And then the one other card I think I'll show, actually a couple more. Another card I'll show, it's a track and field card. All three of my kids do track and field, and this is from the 2012 Panini Adrenaline Olympic set. It's a London glitter foil, and it's of Usain Bolt, right? This will not show up well on the camera because it's so glittery.
I see it to some extent. Yeah.
It's a beautiful card. So I worked in sport. I probably say this too much sometimes, but I worked in sports media years and years and years ago, and everybody was very nice. It's not, there are no horror stories or anything like that. But after a while, you be kind of just you see things once, you've seen them a dozen times, right? Michael Jordan had the flu game, and then 15 years later, Tim Tebow in college football had a flu game. But 20 years before Jordan, Mickey Mantle had a flu game. You sort of see repetition. It's really rare that you see something that you haven't seen before. Usain Bolt was something I'd never seen before when he went off during the 2008 Olympics and was looking backward at his competitors when he was so far ahead. I jumped out of my seat, and it had been so long since I'd had an athlete give me that feeling of when I was a kid, that when I realized that this card existed, I thought I have to get this. I remember that moment, rewinding it on the old DVR to watch it a second time. Did he really just do that? Did he just do that? And my wife and I were like high-fiving and in awe of what he had done. And so this was from his second Olympic Games. This was from 2012 when, this was in the London Games. It's from a trading card set. Or I'm sorry, it was actually like a game you could play, and that was great. And so that's the second one. I love this card. I think it's the only track and field card I have. I'd love to own a Jesse Owens someday, but that's a little bit out of the budget.
They have, yeah, there's what, a 1936 set, I think, Samel work, maybe.
It's in German, right? It's in
Yeah,
German on the back. Yeah.
I have a water polo card from that set.
No.
Yeah. Anyway, so but those always come up when you look up 1936.
Yeah, always.
Yeah.
Always. So you can tell that my cards then are that try to have some sort of a personal connection. And then the last card I have here is a baseball card. It's when I was a kid, I'll show it in just a second. It used to be a retail store. They're gone now in the US, called Kmart. And Kmart was just a really cheap store where you'd go and you couldn't afford the more expensive stores, and that's where we shopped. And I'm sorry, not Kmart, Woolworth. It was Woolworth.
Okay.
I did go to Kmart a lot, but this is a Woolworth set. They put out a 1985 Woolworth top set. I got the set. It came to, I don't know how many cards there were in the set, maybe 50 or 60. And I had them all and then just got rid of them at some point. But I found this card of Dwight Gooden, who was the star rookie of the 1985 baseball season. And I found this Woolworth card in a PSA 10 on eBay. And it just hit me like a wave of nostalgia when I saw the set. I remember this border. I remember I had this. Plus, it was in a PSA 10. Plus, it was this alternative variation Dwight Gooden rookie card. And it wasn't that much. But whenever I look at this, again, it takes me back 40 years at this point, right? So between Marvin Barnes, taking me back to, I wish that St. Louis still had a basketball team, but Marvin Barnes makes me remember that period. Or at least makes me wish I had been able to remember it. Usain Bolt makes me think of that time my wife and I were watching him run faster than we'd ever seen anybody run before, and to be able to look back and almost admire his own performance as he was running a race as short as the 100 meters. Plus this PSA 10 of the star rookie from the set that I owned 40 years ago. That's a lot of what I look for. There are some cards I care about for the value. I'm not going to lie about that. But the cards that I take out and look the most are the ones that I think about in some more personal way versus the economic benefits.
Yeah, that's kind of the secret value of cards is, better than owning stocks, or, because at least, if either goes to zero, at least the card, you still got the card and the feelings that come with it, right? Um,
Right.
so, and nostalgia is, a hell of a drug, let's say. So I think someone said about a different drug once, but sorry, we should keep this PG maybe, but anyway, so it's a wonderful feeling. Sorry, I'm just gonna edit that out actually. Um, but the yeah, I mean, the ability to kind of connect through nostalgia to your memories, your personal memories, is really an amazing thing about cards for me as well, and I think a lot of people feel that as well. I mentioned the subtitle of your podcast for a reason. I think most people just say the shallow end, but to kind of explain it more is, how to collect on a budget, which the vast majority of us are on, and how to gain kind of as much joy from the hobby as people who are posting things on Instagram that we may have envy for. I do. It's natural. But that to kind of not get caught into that comparative mindset, and worrying about that your collection is not as good or something. So, if you could kind of practically walk us through kind of how you budget. It's maybe a little accounting boring, but I think it might be helpful to people, to kind of hear kind of practically how you do it, because I know you've talked about it on your podcast as well. But
You're right. Uh, as to borrow somebody else's cliche, comparison is the thief of joy. And FOMO is the specter that looms over this hobby. At least for me, I'll just speak for myself. Right? FOMO is the worst. I almost bought a Luka card, Luka Doncic, the other day. I don't collect basketball except for some of the, there he is. There's Luka, right? I had some when I first got back on the hobby because I thought that's who I should be collecting. And then I realized I have no collection to him and he whines too much. And I didn't want to collect because he drives me nuts. But now here he is on the precipice of reaching the NBA finals as we're recording this. And I think, ooh, I should get into Luka now. Like, and then this other side of my brain says, stop. Don't do this. This will mess up your entire collection if you go and buy Purple Prism, which is the one I like. Right? That's the one that would really mess it up. So the way that I budget is like many, I have a separate account for my cards away from the family. Uh, so if I sell a card on eBay, that's where it goes. It goes into that account. So it's always kept separate. Nothing from our paychecks, either my wife's or mine, goes into that. One reason is that my wife earns quite a bit more than I do, and so I respect that the burden that's on her to think about mortgage and all the other expenses that we have. And my income is pretty middle class. It's fine if God forbid, something happened to her job, we'd have to downsize our life, but we would just have a smaller house. We'd be okay. But because so much of the burden is on her, I don't want to say how much of our percentage can I put into sports cards. I just she'd glare at me with justifiably with daggers for eyes. And so the way that when I got back into the hobby during COVID, I wasn't originally back into it. I had gone home to St. Louis. I don't live there anymore, just to visit my dad, see how he was doing. And then all my sports cards were still there. He had never touched them. My parents never moved them. They were still on that side of my childhood closet. I brought them back, recycled a bunch of the junk wax that weren't worth anything, and then graded some and then sold most of them and held on to one card that I sold, like held on to the money from it.
mm-hmm.
And it all really stemmed from that. It was a 1991 Upper Deck Michael Jordan that graded into a PSA 10, and it was him wearing a Chicago White Sox baseball uniform. I couldn't figure out why it was worth so much, but it sold for $800. So yay, right?
Right.
And and so that's where it all began. And I've been playing with that money essentially since. Made some really bad moves, but also made some really lucky ones as well. And sold at the right time. Listened, like I mentioned before, how I listen to podcasts to learn how to do this. And some really good advice that multiple people said was sell high, which is the same thing with stocks, right? But it was sell high, especially if you don't have any personal connection to that player. And so I would just sort of force myself to do that. And there have been two separate instances now where I've had a decent sized collection of Shohei Ohtani cards, and both times I've sold them off, thinking I can get them back in 6 years or 7 years or 5 years if I need to. And that's really helped sustain it. It's helped offset some of the really bad. I've taken my losses pretty bad sometimes when I've tried to dip my toe into the waters where I don't belong. I've learned some really hard lessons. But essentially what I do is I just try to spend within my means. And in order to get a card, I oftentimes have to sell cards. Um, Not often. That's basically what I do. Or I wait until there's a moment where I realize, oh, okay, now's a good time to sell. And do I really need six cards of a person, or is one or two fine? And then I'll sell it off. And then I have a new pool of money. And every several months, that's sort of how I will replenish my budget, which is selling things that so we know we think we want things at one moment, or we do want them at one moment. And then later on, we realize that was nice. I enjoyed it. And now it's time to try something different.
Yeah, and that many things you said interesting there, but also the cards that you know you can get back later if you really want them. I did that with a Luka card and a couple Lukas because I just bought way too many when I got back in. He's my favorite player. I think of all time even. It's kind of weird that he's a current player that I can say that. But and I just said, okay, fine. So I sold a few and then I already bought one back because they were much lower, and so it is a smart way to manage your finances.
And don't you
So
think too that you kind of know which ones you can get back and which ones you can't. And the ones that you like and you can't get back, you just set those aside. And those become your forever cards or whatever you want to call it. And like you said, you just have to make those decisions as you go.
yeah, yeah. Um, well, yeah, I mean, the just for me emphasizing I think listening to your story about how your connections to the three cards you showed and just, we all have that with sports. That's why sports it's basically, to me, it's kind of replaced religion for many people in some respects. I mean, we're fanatical. So it's very similar. Like it's just like a belief or faith in something and a feeling. So channeling that is just a wonderful thing about the cardboard. I mean, it's obviously just pieces of paper, but that's what gives it meaning. And so, I appreciate your connections to the cards, is basically what I'm trying to say in a, a long-winded way.
Yeah, I think you're right. What you said about sports, and thank you for saying that. You're right. Sports, we are fanatics, no pun intended. I try to follow along with football, meaning the real football, as much as I can. Having come to it late, I don't know a lot of the history to it, but I think my favorite part is listening to the crowds
Mhm.
and the songs and the chants. And there's something communal about that brings people together. Because you know that the politics of the people in that stadium vary from person to person. But when it comes to what can bring people together, it's it is sports, for better or worse.
Yeah, and I do think that feeling it's just a little more intense in like European football, because it's based on really their I mean the club was started in that town or city or neighborhood, and one the Manchester teams, for instance, I mean they're more working class coming from like industrial revolution kind of roots of working class, or yeah, there are all these kinds of examples, but where it's so intense. And the other reason why is a relegation, I think, where I mean it's like life or death. I mean, if you start falling down to the second division, then if you don't get back up after the first year, you lose your parachute money going down, and then it really starts getting bleak, and you can just keep falling. So it's yeah.
I wish US sports had relegation because it makes it so much more interesting. It makes the stakes even higher.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I call American sports a socialist oligarchy. I
Yes.
mean, it is an oligarchy of the owners, and then but then when you have all these socialist rules where, like, salary caps and max salaries and drafts, if you're bad, you get better. It's kind of whereas European football is kind of this it's really the Wild West, capitalist. I mean, there are no safety nets, so
Yep. Yep.
um yeah. So I think those the crowd thing is pretty incredible. I remember Nikola Jokic was interviewed about, do you think you'll be able to handle the crowd? And I want to say, I forget what city he was going to, but he's like, I played in Serbia, man. Like, it's like that. Then
Right, right. You survive those crowds and what that region of the world went through. You can survive the Minnesota Timberwolves road crowd. You'll be fine.
yeah, exactly. It's but good to be loud. So I guess just a little bit about podcasting. I wanted to ask you about. You have not done a YouTube channel. You
I
just
have one
play.
that it exists. I just don't update it. Don't
Okay.
even look for it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a placeholder in case I ever want to use it.
Okay. So you just prefer the podcasting medium as for.
I do. Sound and video are two different things. And I consume mostly through podcasts is how I consume sports content, sports media content, and sports card content. And even the podcast, I'm sorry, even the YouTube channels that I like for sports cards, I will just put them on my phone and just listen to it with earbuds and not watch the video. And so part of it is because of time. I just don't have the time to make the video look the way I want it to. But more, it's an appreciation for audio over video.
Hmm. Hmm. I like that too. I mean, I just feel like I don't have time to sit at a computer and watch YouTube videos. But I can tell you most people prefer that. It seems like, content wise, that's at least my experience.
They do. I just, you and I, we both have kids, and maybe that's part of it.
Hmm.
But if I'm going to sit down and watch something, I'm going to watch a show with my wife. But otherwise, if I'm listening to podcasts, that's when I'm walking the dogs or doing the dishes or driving to work, which is the majority of the time. I don't want to just sit there and I don't know. I don't think that's time well spent for me anyway.
Any this is a tangent, but any TV recs at the moment?
Just finished Three Body Problem on Netflix, which was this historically significant sci-fi book series from I don't know how long ago, 20, 30 years ago, that I didn't really want to read, but thank you, Netflix, for taking 3,000 pages and turning it into 8 episodes for me. So it's called The Three Body Problem. I just watched that. And then the other one that I'm watching now, and I'm behind the times, is I'm finally making my way through Game of Thrones. I'm on season 5. My wife watched it during COVID. I don't want to deal with it then. But then she said, "Why don't you try it again?" This is about a few months ago, and now I'm hooked. So we're on I think season 5 or 6 of Game of Thrones. So it feels funny to recommend a show that everybody already knows that I'm late on, but yeah, I'm all in.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm jealous that you get to go through it for the first time. I thought it was amazing.
It is terrific. It's getting a little bit slow. Now you can tell that they're getting to the point where he stopped writing and they had to start making up their own. And he swears that by the end of this year, the book's going to be out, but he's been saying that for 10 years now.
Yeah, yeah.
George R. R. Martin. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, well, do you have anything you wanted to bring up kind of in relation to a global audience? Any kind of advice or thoughts, for those listening out there?
I would just say if you choose to and if you're comfortable doing it, just step out and make yourself heard and say hello. And for someone like me, that was really hard to do. So I don't want to tell you that it's the super easy thing to do, but stepping out and saying hello to people really changed and evolved my hobby experience. And so this would be, you mentioned to say anything to a global audience. I would say just say hi. I want to see your cards. I want to hear about your collecting, and there are lots of people who do as well. I think between this podcast and then the content that came out of the Macau um, card show from late last year, earlier this year, whenever that was, to see the level of collectors that are out there and the types of cards that are out there, you realize I was basically felt like I was consuming content inside a silo, and it was almost an incomplete experience. And without people from all parts of the world, I want to see. If you're, from the New Zealand, Australia area, I want to see your cards from the All Blacks. I want to see your cards from Manchester United. I want to see your cricket cards. I want to see everything. I want to see basketball. I want to see it all. If it's made, I want to see it. Heck, I want to see sumo. Do they make sumo cards in Japan? I don't know. I want to see sumo. I'd love to see that. The hobby is bigger than Western Europe and North America. It's so much bigger. And to just take a step out there and to be able to meet new people and to realize the cards are just a way, I think, to really meet people and to really bridge the oceans. That's what I would hope that you would do. And that's what I'm trying to do. Sometimes I fail, sometimes I succeed, but if you see somebody with a card that you like, don't reach out and say, hey, how much? Reach out and say, hey, great card. I also collect so and so, or I have this another card from that set, the different player that I collect. And then that's how you make connections. And that's how this big world becomes small. Well, at the same time, the hobby becomes bigger.
That that's awesome. I share that. And I do find that people are a bit shy to kind of even I've invited them to come onto the podcast and they seem reluctant, and I don't want to put my face on the internet or these kinds of things. But um, you know, there's no, like, also kind of no one really cares. It's kind of like, in the sense that, you know, we all just want to share, and then we'll go on, but at least we made the contact, and got to share our experiences, like yours, like mine. We all have these connections. So it's I find cards just such a nice way to learn about sports and history. So just as you say, just show me the stuff and then I'll learn about it, and it's interesting. So very well put. And thank you for that. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to the audience and listeners for your time and spending it here with us. I'll just kind of close and say you can find Dave again at Iowa _Dave _sports cards on Instagram. His podcast again is called The Shallow End, and it's highly recommended. All kinds of I think relatable sharing. He has guests on, or does kind of solo prepared episodes as well. So, and if you're into women's basketball, he did a Caitlin Clark megapod recently, which might give you again a window into that world, which is, I think, a nascent one and developing. So I highly recommend it. And with that, anything else to add before we go, Dave?
No, John, thank you for having me on, and thanks to your audience. You have just a terrific audience and a great platform. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one. Take care, everybody.